Hey, this is Daniel Levin, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Ahlan wa sahlan, Abu
كيفك؟
Ben. It's great to have you on the show.
كي-
Kafik.
كيف كيفك حبيبي؟ الحمد لله. كيفك؟ شو أخبارك؟
Hey, so you've got this incredible book, which I had in front of me a second ago, but here it is. I'm listening to it on my phone right now at the moment. I got it on the audiobook style. It's called Proof of Life. And what makes this book incredible for everybody listening is Dan lived out a thriller movie, but it was real. And then he wrote about it in your book, dude. I mean, I'm a counterintelligence agent. I've worked overseas a lot. And so much of what you've done, maybe we approach the problem differently, but so much of what you talk about in the book has really impacted me because you're right on the thing. And what's crazy is as I'm listening and reading through the book, I'm thinking, this is a movie. This isn't real life, but it was real life. Can you even believe you did this thing and survived it?
You know, the strange thing about it is, I mean, all this took place in 2014, and while I was experiencing it, it didn't feel like this was a movie script. Then when I wrote it down, and I had some people read the manuscript, and I got reactions where the people started to be incredulous, say, "Man, this reads like a movie script." And it really, when you're in the midst of it all, I mean, I do diaries. I've been writing diaries for over 45 years, and so you chronicle your days. You don't really see it that way in the midst of it all. Once you take a step back, you write down the book or you read the book, and then you start to realize, wow, this has a completely different feel to it.
Yeah, and that realization that you get, it does come later. There are so many times when I tell someone a story and I see the expression on their face change, and I go, "Oh my gosh, this firefight that I was in is one of my favorite stories about. Like I'm in this firefight, but in the meantime, I have to talk to someone. So I'm talking to someone, and there are bullets splashing on the building that we're like in an alleyway, sort of, right? And we're totally safe. Nothing's going to hit us or anything. But there are bullets impacting the building that we're on as people are fighting things up. But they're not fighting us. They're fighting someone else. And if it turns and changes, we can egress out a different way. And when I tell that story to people and say, yeah, there was an active gunfight, I don't know, 10, 15 bullets, and then like the cement chips would hit us and everything. But again, totally fine. And I had work to do. And so we were having this conversation. I know you can appreciate this. And you write about it and you're like, oh my God, that's not at all normal, but in this situation, totally normal.
Yeah, I think anyone who's also experienced combat, I mean, there are all kinds of high pressure situations in life, but I think for you and me, having experienced combat, for me in my youth, it kind of puts you in a different mindset. So I really didn't experience anything cinematic or unusual about it while I'm in the midst of it, because I'm really fighting day by day, layer by layer, trying to meet essentially the next crazy person and to get me to the source of the information I'm looking for. So I'm really stuck in that moment every single time. I don't get the full narrative of the arc of the trajectory of the story until I sit back and reflect back and start writing it down and say, wow, that was actually some pretty crazy stuff.
Yeah, this is an important thing you're talking about. When I'm going out day by day, and it's just so you know, I was a spy, right? And so my job was to go off the camp. And sometimes I'm with the army, sometimes I can't be with the army, but I'm slowly gathering puzzle pieces. And there are so many times in the book where you take an action and it actually unlocks for you a piece of the puzzle later on, whether you're, standing up for someone who needs standing up for, whatever it is. And so I know I become aware like what I do at any given moment may matter. I need to act genuine how I'd normally act, but and it's one of the reasons why I don't typically focus on any kind of deception or control of the conversation because I'm trying to figure out how to interact in their world. I know you're trying to sort these things out, and there are so many unknown unknowns. You can put a lot of extra work on yourself to try to master your environment when you really are kind of, I think at least, you end up kind of being along for the ride.
Yeah, I mean, this is really critical. It's very funny getting reactions from people who, especially, there were actually film rights were sold for this manuscript, and it's really interesting in the auction process, getting all kinds of expressions of interest that wanted to turn this into kind of a Jason Bourne kind of Jack Reacher type of caricature. And I kept saying, you're really missing the point. It's not so much that I don't have superpowers and don't paraglide into, a prison or something, obviously. But it's also that all those narratives are about the main protagonist. Whereas for me, I am I'm more of a bystander and not less of an actor. And the more authentically I can sort of just meld, just mix into the context, be part of a conversation, not stand out through my accent or through my skin color or through the way I dress or through the way I eat. The less I stand out, the more successful I'm going to be. So the more I'm effacing myself in all those moments, the more successful. So there's this real gap, and it's not so much that I don't jump out of airplanes without parachutes. That's just silly. But in terms of even just not making yourself the story, in order to be successful in this kind of a activity, you really have to avoid making yourself the story. Once you made yourself the story, you're done. You're done. You, first of all, you might be in danger, but second of all, you're certainly not going to advance any further on these kinds of peeling away the layers of the onion.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely approaching this problem from the same direction. I mean, the thing I had as I got better and better at this, because I stayed, right, and I continued to work at the ground level, as I realized how damaging my own ego was. My job was to build trust, and if I could build trust, then and I had to graduate. Like, I can extend trust because I'm an American. So here's some low risk trust. Can we meet again? Yes, we can, and we did. Okay, great. There's a proven trust, and then you can escalate it up until the point where, and I know you'll identify with this, when someone's, and I'll say to someone, I'll have the respect, and this is not at all Army style. Like, this is completely out of the norm. I'll say to the Iraqi, the Afghan, the person from whatever country I'm in, and I'll say to them, hey, your time's important to me, and so is your safety and security. I'd love to meet with you. How should we do that? When, where, whatever. And they're like, how about I come get you and just take you to my house? Now, to anybody else, that sounds crazy. To you, we have to do this at some point, because I have to allow that person to be the sheikh that they are, to be the host that they are, to be better at security than I can be. And I have to allow that, but that means I have to surrender all of my things. It doesn't mean I willy-nilly go make bad decisions and put myself in dangerous situations, but I put myself into dangerous situations by design, because I have a trusted and established trust with the person that I'm working with.
Yeah, I mean, it goes down to really very sensitive cultural differences between places. So even if you're accustomed to working in Arab countries, the way you interact with people, the way you greet, the kind of deference to age is very different, let's say in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, than it's going to be in the Gulf, in a Bedouin society. And you really have to pick up on those nuances. If you want to engage with someone at their level, it's not just about the fact that you can say hello in Arabic. It's also about even the small accents, and whether you're taking from a plate, serving the elder first, or whether you're kissing them on the nose or on the forehead to greet them, right? Totally different if you're in Yemen or if you're in Qatar and Abu Dhabi, let alone if you're in the outskirts of Beirut or in Aleppo. And so, those are the small nuances, and it's the ability to appreciate them that is ultimately your biggest sign of respect for the person you're talking to. It's very disarming in that sense, without being sycophantic, without being submissive. It's just that I'm in your place, I'm going to play this on your terms, and I'm going to show that respect. Now, at the end, down the road, there may be something I'll want, but not before we've established a relationship. And that may take years at times, right? So the other thing that you learn is you can't start to act that role just because you need something. These are lines that you have to establish way, way, way in advance. And one day you may need them. One day you'll never need them. One day it might be a favor you do for a third party in return for a fourth party to do something for you. But that kind of a web, you can't spin that in the moment that you need it. You really have to lay those foundations years in advance.
Some of this stuff you learn by simply being humble. And even if you think you know it, and you might know it, I've always found, and I would tell my interpreters, I worked with an interpreter primarily because my Arabic wasn't as good as it could be, but I would say to my interpreter, I'm going to ask questions that I know the answer to, but I want to get their answer to this very specific question, because I want to allow them to teach me. And every time you hear the answer, like the Iraqis would tell me all the time, listen, we're not religious. We're not religious at all. I mean, before you guys got here, we just didn't care. And then to this point, this colonel, and I knew this was a theme, right? And so I would use this to my advantage. So I would ask this person this question. My interpreter would be like, yeah, but they're not religious. I'm like, just ask the question. And then this colonel that I was talking to, he pulls out a whiskey bottle during Ramadan. It's like, let's have some drinks. If I knew everything, every time I was in every meeting, I could never get to that whiskey bottle, which I found the whiskey bottle is very powerful. It's like it's an extension of trust back to me. It's like, hey, I'm going to tell you something that I'm not, I keep this thing in my drawer. Probably everybody knows, but it opens the thing to get to the conversation, to maybe get that puzzle piece, or at least be in the courtyard where the puzzle piece may be someday.
Right. And it's also the patience to wait for them to tell you about the whiskey bottle. So I'm in countless situations where someone else may tell me, listen, Sheikh so-and-so actually really loves, single malt.
Right.
And so I think the mistake most people make is to say, oh, that's an icebreaker. Or say, well, I like single malt. Do you like Macallan? I like Macallan too. And so they bring it up. And the mistake that they just made is that they didn't wait for them to give you that information and create that kind of trust, right? So in other words, be patient and allow for them to trust you enough to share that with you. And then you can start to talk about commonality. So there's always a tendency to want to show off, right? So even when we say we're going to efface our own ego, we really want to know. We want to know that they know how well we speak Arabic, or how well we know how to order the right dishes, or the fact that you can't eat labneh with fish and why you can't eat labneh with fish and stuff like that, right? And the answer is no need to do that. You're in this room because you passed a few thresholds. Let it flow to you. And if you need to self-efface a little bit longer, that's okay. And then, those are nuances that serve you well, but you have to know how to do that with whom. Again, totally different thing. I can be sitting, in Buremi in Oman, or across the border from Al Ain, and have a conversation with a tribal leader there that's completely different than sitting in Riyadh in the palace, right? So totally different settings and different contexts. And that requires some time and nuance and patience. And then the other thing is, of course, to understand that time itself has a completely different meaning. So you're on this frantic schedule. You're trying to find information about a person who went missing. You know that every day can be critical, but you can't put a gun to anyone's head because you just don't have that kind of leverage. You just don't. And you have to understand, I'm going into those spaces without power and without leverage. Whatever I can get is because I've established a relationship, and as a result of that relationship can advance. That's all. I have absolutely nothing to squeeze anybody with. And that's, it's in a way liberating, but of course it can also be frustrating.
I've also found that I totally agree with what you're saying. Time really belongs to them. Like you can nudge things along, but you're nudging things along by design, not by desire. And so I'll give an example, and this is again for the audience so that they can understand. But me and this Army guy that I'm working with, the Army guy's junior, and he's trying to get something done because his commander wants it done. When we go in, and it's like the evening time, and we're so bad in the States at understanding culture. We fear culture. We don't want to offend somebody. But the reality is if you just allow it to, like, if you can understand that it's different and then allow it to be different until you can get up to speed with their culture, you'll do a lot better. So we walk into this room and there's a bunch of Iraqi army guys, and they're watching TV. And this lieutenant's like barking, hey, trying to get down. And I'm like, dude, they're all watching soccer. Let's ask a simple question. Why are y'all watching soccer? And they're like, oh, it's the Arab Cup. And I'm like, And I look at the LT and I'm like, we're not working right now. Our work is right here and watching Arab Cup with these guys. And it broke his brain to not do his job. And I'm like, you're doing your job right now. You're partnering at a level that you haven't even been trained. Like, just sit here and watch this game. Same thing with the food thing. I typically eat left-handed. And so I would say to them, like, I eat left-handed. What does that mean to you guys? And they're like, look, you're an American. You're not Islamic. It's fine. You can eat left-handed. We don't care. We know you're not from here. And so that taught me you can't out Iraq and Iraqi. You can't out Jordan or Jordanian. You just can't do it. And so don't try to do it. Be yourself. Be respectful, but be yourself. In your book, you talk about the experience when one of the players says, hey, you got to watch how you sit, because if you point your feet towards someone, they'll take offense. And that's something that you can even make that offense and recover from it because you are different. But you have to know that that's like that, how to correct that offense.
Right. And then there are fine nuances. There are going to be situations where if you try too hard to adjust, you're being too submissive, right? So there comes a moment where you have to be respectful, but you can also, so for example, there are certainly moments where I strategically choose not to speak in Arabic, and sometimes I even strategically choose not to speak in English. I know that someone speaks broken French, and I'll just choose French because it gives me a strategic advantage without being rude. So in other words, they have an option of bringing a translator if they want it. So, it's not always just about adjusting and making sure that everyone knows how sensitive to your culture, but you have to make a conscious choice and read the room properly also, not just barge in and just kind of say, okay, here I am, this is what I need. It doesn't work that way. Something may well be transactional. In other words, it's still going to be quid pro quo, whether it's directly with you or through, usually more likely through other parties, to get information, to get a hostage, to negotiate a price, whatever the case may be. But it does not mean just because it's transactional that you don't have to, first of all, establish a relationship. And if you want to be really crude in the way you look at it, the more you've established a relationship, the lower the price gets for what you're trying to get, essentially.
One of the things that I think we often lose sight of because we are too ego focused is that the things we say are repeated outside of that room to other people. You know, they talk about us, right? And so like one of the things that got out in my region where I was at was that, you know, I was uncomfortable for me to sit on the floor because my body just doesn't work right. You know, motorcycle accidents and lots of army. And so I would always just ask for a chair. And I'm like, I don't take offense, but my body just doesn't work right. And so then the next thing you know, and this is the Arab culture to a T. Every time I showed up to a meeting, no look, no spoken word, no nothing. And all of a sudden a chair would show up because they knew Abu Brenna needed a chair. And so like the sheikh wouldn't have to even say it. His son would just be like, and he would just, you know, and there's like, there's just a magic to that. And it taught me like, hey, don't forget these guys all know each other and they're going to say, hey, the Americans came by the other day. And so what you do is I chose to never lie. Like, okay, I mean, sometimes you don't have to tell the whole truth, but I chose to be honest as a default so that my own previous self didn't undermine my future self.
Right. Right. Yeah, you definitely have to, first of all, it's a better way to go through life any which way. And I think that people have a much more keen radar for people who are inauthentic than we assume. For some reason, we have this bizarre thing baked into our ego where we think we're the only ones who can detect a lie or an inauthentic person. Everyone around us does have that too. And then you're also in a culture, you know, I'm sort of descending, whether it is Beirut or Dubai or Saudi Arabia, wherever it is. And, you know, I'm descending into a culture, especially in the Gulf, where for the last 50, 60 years, locals have been accustomed to being flattered and trying to be used or taken advantage of because they're just perceived as being immensely wealthy. Yeah. And so their radars for fake, you know, friendship and saccharine kind of, you know, niceties is highly sensitive. So, you know, there are many, many people I know that I've known for 15, 20 years before we even advance to the next level, before I've set foot into their house. I might make it, you know, to the majlis on the outside of the house in the courtyard, but before I've even made it into a home, you know, I go through years, sometimes decades of time to do that. And you're sort of, and the when you're admitted in is when it's perceived as being authentic. And they don't really care how good your Arabic is at that moment. It's really more about whether your relationship is authentic, meaning there's a friendship there that goes beyond just wanting something from someone. And that's a fine line. There are, even in the work that I do, there are moments where I choose not to go at a person for information or for help because it would completely demolish that relationship that I have, you know, and you just have to leave it on the side and say, that's not this. I'm not going to mix those things up.
One of the things too is we often think that money is the answer to every problem, and this is a rule that I developed, is that when you go to a place like Syria, where a lot of this book is focused, we are good at stability. We are not good at instability. We're certainly not better than Syrians or Kurds at living in an unstable place. They are excellent at it. And part of that is because they've learned to, you know, they don't, like I was always told, you Americans trust too easily, you know, and there's all this deceit that has to happen to accomplish the goal. And that's the best way I can explain it, because it's not deceit. It's just like this pro forma way of getting things done. It's never direct. It's always through the side door. And you can't always be up front. And Americans were always so upfront and dealing with these things. So one of the things I found out is that you say, what is the least thing, like the smallest thing that we could just do right now that would improve your life, your village, whatever it is? Like, what's something that we should just be able to right now do? And they would say the most simple, mundane things, like if we could just flatten that piece of road over there where the ruts are, because it tears our cars apart. And then now you're working on something that you really could, in theory, just grab some shovels and just start smashing down dirt. But you have something that's tangible, and they're not asking for $1 million. They're asking for help in a very specific and practical way.
Yeah, I mean, in the army, in my army days, we'd go into a village and it'd be, again, how do we bridge this? How do we create relationships? Sometimes it'd be toothpaste. I mean, stuff like that, where it's like, hey, no problem solved, we can get you something from those supplies. But yeah, I think that the hardest thing in the work is specifically when hostages are involved for me is that you do have a clock ticking. And so you have on the one hand this absolute existential need to be patient and roll along with the relationships and the conversations and layer after layer after layer. And at the same time, you know that time is not your friend, and that the chances of getting some, information, let alone getting someone alive, at some point just go down exponentially, right? So there's kind of a cliff. And so that's really hard, is to go through those relationships, go through those motions. And so one way to solve that is to not be the one who communicates a sense of urgency, right? So in other words, you still have trusted relationships that are local, that are able to communicate to the local sheikh, let's say, look, Daniel is trying to be respectful, and he obviously is going to adjust entirely to your pacing, but I know, and not from him, and he hasn't asked me to say this, but he's going to be here for the relationship, and he's going to be coming back, and he'll be in our lives for a while. But in the meantime, I think we're all benefiting if we can help or save this person, or whatever the case may be. So sometimes it's not really a good cop, bad cop thing, but if you do have a clock ticking and an urgency that you can't just change, you need to do this with multiple people so someone else can deliver. But that, again, requires a pre-existing relationship of trust. Otherwise, you're done.
And also, again, like smashing that ego back into its cage,
right.
So that you're not just making it about you. And what you're really talking about, at least from my point of view, is how you use an interpreter. An interpreter doesn't have to interpret the language only. There's certain things where I will pre-brief my interpreter, because I want, like, they're part of me and they're going to be part of them. So I need them to understand, like, what I'm trying to accomplish. And they'll say, this isn't how we approach this. Let me handle this for you, because they know the culture better than I ever will. And then they're able to massage us from, and I just have to I always liken it to, I'm riding a wild horse and I just let my hands go off the reins. And I know that I'm going to get there, but the less in control I am to get, if they've got a better path that gets me to where I need to be, and faster and more efficiently, then I want to use that path. But it is terrifying until you get used to the fact that you also have to trust this other person, this agent, and they can bring you what you need, but you're just going to have to like put a lot of trust into that relationship.
Yeah, interpreters, I have an interesting relationship with interpreters. So obviously, if I'm in a country, if I'm in China or Russia, and I just don't, speak a language or speak it well enough to really conduct a conversation, I just need an interpreter. But if I am in a country where I actually speak the language, I will often still have an interpreter or a friend who will interpret. And I'll do it for two main reasons. One is the one that should be obvious to anyone, which is an interpreter buys you more time to think. And I don't know why this isn't more obvious to more people, but just we make so many terrible mistakes when our mouths are just a little bit faster than our minds. So this extra time is invaluable. That's number one. And then the second reason, which is no less important, is an interpreter in a situation can often reveal the truth, in the sense that the person I'm actually talking to sometimes feels much more comfortable talking to an interpreter. Even if it was my interpreter, for some reason that consciousness is switched off, and they think they kind of have an ally in the interpreter, and they can express themselves. They will say, well, tell so-and-so there's no way I'm going to do that unless, and then they say, but that's not what I want you to tell them. I'm hearing the whole conversation, understanding it, and I have to then remind myself, I can't react to what he just said. I can't move my face. I can just sit there. I can smile. And then the interpreter turns around and looks at me and says, this is the way we need to do it. And he leaves away all the other stuff. And then you again have to check your ego. None of those stupid jokes, like, really? Because it sounded like he said a whole lot more than what you just said and all that. Forget all that. Play along with it. It buys so much. It really enables, it gives you so many more tools and just so many more weapons to solve this. So I very, very often go into these meetings with interpreters, even when afterwards in dinner, we can have a direct conversation in Arabic or in any other language.
Right. No, it's so true. And it's a thing. It's a shame that the military, when we would go places, that we don't take that seriously. Most of the interpreter training is focused on mistrust. And you're always testing. Like, this person oftentimes is an American or a legal alien of America who's older than the person they're working with, and you're like, you have to at some point,
right.
And that time is invaluable, because I found that my first instinct for the question is not the best question. And then, and I think this will make sense to you, I'm listening for things, not to you. Yes, I hear everything you're saying, but I'm listening for the lever that I want to pull or the lever I want to push, because what my ego wants me to ask is often not the right question. And sometimes I'm just going to stay on path and I'm going to use those first questions. But sometimes there's a more subtle way, and even just like a level one word question or silence or a nod, where the person just continues past where they normally would have talked, and then they get into a new zone. One of my favorite questions, and this is how they say it in Iraqi Arabic, so I don't know how they say it exactly. Maybe it's Hunu, right? But Shunu Rai, what's your opinion on this? And then you ask someone who has an opinion, you ask them their opinion as an American. I found that they're just like, wow, you actually care what I think? And I'm like, of course, Habibi. I'm desperate to know. I know what I think. I want to know what you think. And it's hard to get people to shut up once you ask them for their input. And you've got to deal with what comes out of their mouth. But the reality is you can get a lot of understanding of people when you ask that question.
Right. And you need to, there's subtleties to it. So even if you want something from someone, if you're in the Gulf, a person of authority, they can say, yeah, I'm going to do it. And they can say whatever, with God's help, whatever the words may be. Right. But inshallah and this and whatever the context may be. But in the Gulf, if you hear the word tum, it just means done. Mm-hmm. Like nothing is going to break this bond. It is more valuable than inshallah. It's no bisharafi, none of that. It's going to be tum means this deal is closed. Mm-hmm. And so an interpreter is not going to translate that way. But if you're picking up on those nuances, it really gives you that time. The other thing with an interpreter that's really helpful, I think that negotiators in any context, military intelligence, civilian intelligence, hostage negotiations, again, FBI, military, whatever the context may be, I think we're often wrongly taught to sort of look at body language and see, what do you think of body language and how's the person sitting? Does he look comfortable, not comfortable? And having an interpreter actually gives you more of an opportunity to see a change in body language. So it's really more about understanding a person's baseline and see how it changes than just looking something like a snapshot and thinking you can read something out of that. So having a little bit more of a stretch, it's a dynamic stretch in that sense, is just really valuable. So, it's something I really don't surrender. In fact, I often have situations where I'm in meetings, there are interpreters there, and then afterwards we go and break bread. No more interpreter. I'm just having direct conversations. And I realize how many more mistakes I make because I don't have that buffer to observe, that buffer to think, that buffer to listen, right? And then my ego trips me up, right? That's when, God, I talk a little bit too much and it's a little bit too much about myself and I'm dominated too much airtime. And then I reflect back and said, man, I spoke 70% of the time, right? So it's really slowing yourself down. It's also what behavioral psychologists like Danny Kahneman talks about, system 1, system 2. Having an interpreter allows you to delay that gut moment. Yep. So in other words, use your head a little bit more. We all have prejudices and gut, but it delays that moment for you. And it's really valuable. And it's certainly valuable when you're negotiating for someone else's life.
When I use body language, and I'm pretty good at it, and sometimes the truth will be screamed at me in body language. And I'm thankful for those times because it's easier, right? But a lot of times I'm just using it as a tool. Like if I see hands above the heart, I know that they're excited. If their feet come off the floor, they're like, okay, this person's excited. How do I use this? Or, what does that mean? Why and you start thinking through, and you need those extra seconds that the interpreter gives you to go, wow, this guy's really fired up. Maybe now is the time to ask him for that thing that I want because they are fired up, right. Whatever it is. And that's sort of what I also use it as like a test. Like, okay, I believe this person. I don't focus so much on deception. I know there's deception going on all the time. I mean, it's just how it works in that part of the world. They're not being completely honest. So I kind of reject those things, but I'm looking for a pattern. Like, can I reliably predict if this person is going to get excited by this or down or whatever it is? And I try to use it as a cue to how I should ask this next question or make this next statement. Does that resonate at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that I'm always, I write this in the book. This mentor who passed away 5-6 years ago, I was extremely keen of, a gentleman who was in his late 80s. He always said one thing, which is, he didn't invent this, and he always said, if you're looking or playing poker, looking around the room and you can't figure out who the sucker is, chances are it's you.
Right.
And so for me, the deception thing, I'm extremely careful with that. First of all, I'm already in an environment that's not my home environment. I'm in an environment where I'm trying to get something. I'm in an environment where everyone knows I'm trying to get something. Once you start playing that game that I know that you know that I know that you know, right, and you're starting to play the player, it's not going to end well. It might go well once or twice, but you're then essentially playing double or nothing. And eventually people who play double or nothing end up with nothing. So that's just statistics. That's not an opinion. And so, I'm very, very careful with the use of deception. Now, there are moments, emergency moments, I write about them in the book when I catch up with this drug gang leader in Dubai, where, you really have to figure out your strategy,
Right.
and you have to cover what it is that you actually want. And you have to figure out how you get that. You can't intimidate him. You can't bribe him. The only way you can do him is allow him to reveal himself, right? Through flattery. Yeah. And even that has to be subtle. If it's too thick, he'll pick up on that. So that's the form of deception, essentially, is just allow people to trip themselves up, right? That's the best you can do.
This is, I get told you in an email, and I love this book. I love the things that you pick up on. I mean, you approach things in a different way than I would, but that's just always going to be the case. We have common approaches, but the details and your reliance and ability to communicate, just fantastic. Everybody should get it. The book is called Proof of Life, and it's about this Daniel on this adventure trying to rescue this. And I'm not going to go into too much about, how the story goes, because you should read the book. And it's, again, when you read the book, you're going to keep thinking you're reading a fictional thriller, but it's a real story of trying to rescue this kid that's been disappeared in Syria. To get people that have disappeared in Syria to meet a drug dealer means that guys like you, guys like me, my main job, and I say all the time, like, one of the reasons why I didn't get a job when I came back from Iraq and Afghanistan was that my job was to know warlords, to know the most evil people in that region, because they're the ones planning the nefarious things that we're trying to stop. And so you go and you meet someone. I met this guy in Iraq that would laugh about killing women and children for Saddam. Just laugh about it like it was the funniest thing, and describe in great detail all these things. Your face has to be, you have to even laugh sometimes with these guys, because you're trying to identify with someone who is literally the face of pure evil. You can't, like I always say with culture, you don't have to approve of men and young boys having sex in the Middle East, but it is a reality. And so you can't fix that problem right here in this meeting. And you might have to look at something or hear about something, and like, you may choose to take that thing on, but goodbye mission, right? I mean, you're taking on a different thing.
Right.
So when you deal with these people that are the face of evil, and you have to, I don't care that you sell women. What I care about is this particular part of my mission, and that stuff, I'm not here for that.
Yeah, and there are little crutches there. First of all, the first thing you have to figure out in dealing with these kinds of individuals, especially those who have become very powerful and often stupendously wealthy in these wars, like this drug guy who controls 80%, or at the time controlled 80% of the Captagon market in Syria. These are billionaires. They became billionaires in the war. They may be evil by our standards, but they're sure as hell not dumb. And so I think the biggest mistake we make is, for a number of reasons, we associate things with each other that have nothing to do with each other, not correlated. So someone who's evil is not dumb. Someone who's rich, not necessarily stupid either, right? So you have to start to think this through and not go into it with judgments. And then there are going to be moments of shock. So in particular, this drug lord, who he talks about women and young girls that he's taken away from villages and sold to prostitution as if he was selling vacuum cleaners. To him, there's no moral difference between taking a 12-year-old girl and selling her into sex slavery in Dubai than there is between, buying a car or selling a car. To him, it's just a transaction. And so you have to sit there. But if you're going to be forcibly stoic, you're going to play yourself a little bit. In other words, just to sit there with a poker face. First of all, he's going to view it as dissent, right, or judgment. On the other hand, you can't really laugh out loud. It's just going to sound too disingenuous if it's too repulsive. So then you start to figure out even words, whether it's in English or in Arabic. For example, you can say Ya Allah in Arabic, and it can be outrage, or it can be admiration, or just a surprise, right? It's neutral in that way. Or you can say, if someone does something that you think is wrong, you can say shohada, and it sounds sharp, but it can also be kind of funny. Like shohada, you'd say to a kid that's kind of naughty, but really funny at the same time too. So you start to get those crutches. They again buy you time to regain your composure in that moment. But I agree with you that if you over emotionalize the task, you're not going to do well.
Yeah.
And that is that's not just people in the military or intelligence context. So if you are a pediatric oncologist and you get too close to the family and to the child that you're treating for cancer, you're just not going to be able to do your job. You really need to compartmentalize it. It may seem cruel, it may seem unempathetic, but if you can't do that, and look, I mean, we served in the army, I was in Israeli special forces. I mean, it's just, if you're not able to do that, then you really shouldn't be doing this kind of work.
And it is often a tightrope where there's danger on both sides, and you don't know which way to lean because you're not allowed to see what you're doing. You're just kind of doing things in the blind. And again, that kind of takes me back to my whole thing where I just try to be straightforward and honest. You know, sure, I'm a spy by trade. And I'll say to someone, I'm like, yeah, of course I'm here to find things out. And here's the thing is my peers will say, oh, no, you're an information collector. You're a human, and they'll have some kind of industry term. And I'm like, yeah, I don't look at it that way. I look at it from their point of view, looking at me. Mm-hmm. And so, and this is the short story. So I was tasked by name. My partner was tasked by name to grab me and bring me and my friend to a Taliban meeting because the Taliban wanted to sort us out. But because we were always true to what we were doing, and I always say, like, look, I'm going to ask questions. If you don't want to answer them, don't. I'm only here to try to understand so I can help get the Americans to do less of what doesn't work and more of what does. And then also help you guys understand what they're trying to do and to create. I'm trying to channel the influence. I have no, and you'll really recognize this. I have no resources. I have nothing I can. I'm just here to offer a smoother communication path, if that's useful to you guys. And I'm 100%, and I always act that way. And so when the Taliban sees that, and they see that we're respected men, and we respect Islam, and we respect the farmers there, they're like, yeah, those guys are cool. They can hang out in this valley and talk to people.
Right.
But that's not a game one kind of skill, Daniel. You don't learn that you don't learn that in the Israeli Special Forces or in Army counterintelligence school. You learn that on floors, drinking chai, eating whatever they make. I mean, that's where you learn that stuff.
But, you know, partly it's just a result of our life and our backgrounds. I mean, I was born in Israel. Then we moved to Kenya when I was a little boy. And so first I spoke Hebrew. Then we spoke English at home. Then I went to Kenya and I spoke Swahili and Kikuyu and Luo. And I was the only white kid in kindergarten. I was in kindergarten with Uhuru Kenyatta, the current president of Kenya, right? So we're like little kids in the 60s there. And you start to adjust. Then you go back to Israel. Then you go back to Switzerland. So I'm like, then it's new language. And so you're constantly figuring out how to adjust. And I think there's pain in that, in the sense that you're constantly, you know, pitching a tent and then pulling it down again and leaving friends behind, not often saying goodbye. By the time I was 10, I'd lived in different continents, different cultures, different language zones, different religions, everything. So you start to adjust, and you still have to remember who you are. So you're not Zelig, who just, you know, blends into every kind of surrounding. But I think that this ability that now has helped me professionally, but this willingness also to sort of just fit in that way where it's authentic, because you really are not from any other place. I'm not going there holding an American flag or a Swiss flag or an Israeli flag or anything like that. I'm not representing anyone. I'm pretty clear about what I want. And it's on its face, and whatever I can do to get that, I'm willing to do to get that. But you're not playing anyone anymore that way. And it seems, so this mix of fitting in and not overestimating yourself, not a coming in guns. I mean, the most embarrassing meetings are for me, especially when I have official people coming with me, whether they're from an embassy, CIA people sometimes, you know, and they come in there and they kind of hit on the table and say, okay, here's what you have, here's what we have, here's how the solution is going to be. And no one leaves this room until we're done. And people look at you like, what are you talking about? Just go away. My dad told me a story about the late Richard Holbrooke, where he was negotiating. My dad was in the 50s still a diplomat in Cyprus and knew all the players on the Turkish side, on the Greek Cypriot side really well. And he was a very seasoned diplomat. And he told me Holbrooke just marches into a meeting in Cyprus and says, all right, here's what the Turkish side wants. Here's what the Greek side wants. No one's leaving the room until we have this solution. I'm going to broker it. People looked at him and just got up and left. Right. In other words, you're really missing the point, because it's like an umpire coming to a game thinking 50,000 people are there to watch the umpire. You're really just a facilitator. And once you sort of really internalize that, where it's just part of you, I think that part's easy then. I don't think that stuff consciously anymore, because I really am acutely aware of my lack of leverage and my lack of authority.
That meeting, we've all sat in that meeting. I watched a general walk into this, not just rural, but like rugged, distant district. And he's like, we're going to bring in a mall here. This is going to be rebuilt. And I'm just like embarrassed for the guy, because he's so irrelevant in this area.
Right.
And he'd never accept it, but he's just left me a pile of work to go back and go, we all know that's not happening. Let's work on the things that we're actually trying to do. Like, how about get people to accept that they have a government and come to it for help and actually provide some help? Because the Taliban said there's not going to be a mall. This guy has no idea, but
Right.
he's one of the things I would always say, and I'm curious what you think about this. State Department, whoever's going to be, when I would get to a new unit, I'd see the commander, and he's like, "Well, what do you do?" And I'm like, I do the things that we do. And I'm like, what question can I answer for you? Like, what's one thing I can figure out? And it's just sort of I know what he's going to basically say, because commanders are commanders. And he basically would say, I need to know who the guy is, who I need to talk to so I can, win. And I'm like, oh, I know that guy. I already know him. I already know who he is. He looks just like you, and the less you're you, the more you can let me go out and not be a colonel, not have a bag of money, not have all the answers. The ability to shut up and listen.
Right.
The better, the more successful you're going to be, because you're doing too much. You're too big. You're too you. In places like Afghanistan.
I totally agree. Listen, I've gone through this a million times. By the way, not just in the Middle East. I've been in U.S.-China military meetings where, Secretary of State, literally now, grandstands something about some whatever it is, something that the U.S. is never going to accept, and then look at him like, "What are you talking about?
Yeah,
like, you're in no position. You're writing checks no one can cash.
Right?
Like, what are you talking about?" And so this, and I've been to meetings at the Lebanese-Syrian border where people from the U.S. Embassy show up in a bunch of dark SUVs and pull up, and I hear the locals talk, right, and I'm hearing they're laughing. They're just laughing. Okay, let's go through this theater. Let's play this along. Let's give them a show that they're asking for, right? And you're hearing all this stuff, and you just wish it weren't that way. And then I have to be careful because of split loyalties, right? In other words, I can't really sell my side down the river and trash in them. So it's really more you're trying to bridge those gaps, and it just made work a little bit harder for you. So, and look, most of my work kicks in when the official part failed, right? So if you're talking about hostages, usually it's not like I'm working tandem side by side. Usually what happens is official attempts went dark, right? Just lost, no chance whatsoever. And then you're trying to pick up the pieces. And so I'm usually working without that. But every once in a while, the moments that you described, you just sit there and think, God, I could do without that kind of support.
Thanks for the help. Yeah. One of really good friends of mine is a guy named Dan White. His brother, you probably remember this story, was Michael White, the guy that was abducted or held, in prison in Iran. And someone got him out through intermediaries, because the U.S. and Iran can't talk, but you go through Switzerland and you have these kind of conversations. But here's this thing where you don't know why Michael is even there, but he was, and he gets arrested, and COVID is happening, and he is, either deathly ill or just over being deathly ill from cancer, and I think at one point he had AIDS. It's all this kind of crazy stuff goes on, but someone was the mouthpiece that ultimately got him out, and was like, just shut up and take the out and just go and don't talk about it anymore, and that was kind of the deal. And maybe that was done by the State Department, but I got a feeling that that's probably done through a third party. That is
no. I'm very aware of the case from the Swiss side, and that was the State Department did nothing there. This was all the Swiss side. I can tell you for a fact.
Yeah.
I can't talk about it more than that, but
sure.
Yeah, this is this was done through relationships that existed despite the official statements that were going on there. The same thing with Levinson's body that people were looking for, the guy who disappeared on Kish Island in Iran. Right. When the problem that you have, and this happens again and again, so if you've sanctioned people, whether it's terror groups or whether it's governments or government representatives or state-owned enterprise people, once you've sanctioned people, there's very little you can do officially to establish a contact with them. So if you've sanctioned everyone in the Iranian regime, right, the top 20 layers of the Revolutionary Guards and the Quds Force and so on, and then you want to have a conversation about American who went missing, or even someone that has died, but you want the remains to be returned, whatever the case may be, you're done. There's really nothing left for you to talk about. So then, you either establish something through the Swiss, sometimes other countries do a negotiation, but there's nothing anymore officially you can do, which kind of brings you back to the value of those sanctions exactly. So, what are you going to do that day that you actually do need to have a dialogue for whatever reason? It can be hostages, can be a de-escalation, can be a communication that an escalation wasn't intended. There can be an explosion on a tanker that you never intended, or you didn't intend to escalate, and you make sure that's communicated, but you're no longer communicating with anyone directly. So, I think that if you want to be effective in this kind of work, you should do a whole lot less of these public declarations, even State Department, because there's really nothing to be gained. And the thing to figure out, and you learn this the hard way with hostage negotiations, all those public statements that then got put on social media, right? Because State Department, God forbid, also shouldn't do Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and everything else, right? All that does is it's all done for domestic audience. It's all done for domestic politics and re-elections and so on and so on. But in terms of getting something done, so you have an American who's taken hostage in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Central America, wherever it is. When you're doing those things, you just made it exponentially harder, because the two things happened. One, you pissed off the people who are holding the person. You just are going to piss them off because you're going to call them something. And number two, you just increased the price. Because by doing this officially, you're creating the impression that this person is a high value asset that they're holding. Otherwise, why would a Secretary of State, why would a National Security Advisor, why would a president or vice president or a congressman, why would they be taking such an interest to tweet and to do press conferences? They're only doing that because this must be a high value person, maybe a CIA person, right? And so you just made the job of the negotiators that much harder. The first thing I do in any hostage negotiation when I'm asked is I tell everyone, shut up. Just shut up. Go dark. Shut up. The family, you want to do print T-shirts and bumper stickers, knock yourself out. Public statements, stop talking. Government, stop talking. SPIHA, the special envoy for hostage negotiations in the State Department, shut up. And if they can't do that, I usually step back and say, I'm out. I can't do it.
Yeah. No, you're right, because they're going to create more problems than you can account for, and you can't fix that. It's the book is fantastic. It's called Proof of Life. It's about this crazy story where Daniel goes and tries to help a friend of a friend. And you end up meeting all these people. And again, it's when you read it, you're going to think I'm reading a fiction book. That's how crazy this is. You guys got to check this thing out. There are so many things I want to ask you about with your day-to-day stuff, because it is fascinating. One of the things that's pretty neat when you read the book, when you read about Daniel, like he's multilingual. And he knows these people that are high players in the Middle East, and it's international intrigue. But in real life, this isn't the only time you've done this kind of thing. So are there more books in the hopper that you're going to do?
I don't know yet. I wrote an earlier book called Nothing But a Circus, which was kind of looking back in individual stories of my life in different parts of China, Russia, and other parts of the world, the kind of work I did in Russia in the early 2000s, in Putin's early years. So in terms of hostage negotiations, I'm not sure. I really wrote this book because of a promise I made to two young girls who we managed to get out of there. This is not a spoiler because it's not about the hostage. Two young girls who had been taken from a village in Syria, and we managed to get them out of Dubai and get them into Western Europe, and they live now with new identities. They're, the younger of the two is my daughter's age. My daughter's just turning 23 in a few weeks. So So they're very much in my life, and they helped me actually get the information I was looking for. And in return, they asked me to tell the story. It was the main reason I actually wrote the book. Most of the work that I do is really in the dark in this. I don't talk about hostage negotiations, and certainly don't talk about hostages. It was important for me to tell this story so that the gap between how people perceive these kinds of wars and hostage situations and what the reality is on the ground, that people start to get a little bit of a sense of that stuff. If I'm going to write another book on this, it's going to be the story of these two girls. Okay. And I'm going to write it with them. So that's going to be the next thing I write about, from being taken as young girls, 12 and 14 years old, from a village in Syria, sold into sex slavery, and then escaping that life and starting their new lives. I'm going to write that with them, that story, because we're now working on the screenplay for the book. And there will be some interfacing with their story if they continue to agree to be part of it. So that's kind of what I'm thinking in that respect.
There's so much wisdom in the book, and you hear all these things that people say to you when you write them down. It's wonderful. Like the one of them, I've got like my book of woe, because you hear all these horrible stories. And I want to do a quite quick aside here. When you talk about the atrocities that happen, when, humans are so bad at humanity. I think it's one of the first things you say, I'm paraphrasing what you say, but just there's so many horrible things, and you see the damage of war and conflict and people that are left behind. We talk about PTSD here and how hard it is for veterans. Imagine what it's like to live there, and to not just go home and suffer, but to constantly be there, constantly lose people, not believe you have a chance to do anything. All of these things get shoved into your book of woe, and one of your friends says to you, when you stand on nails, you want to have there be a bed of nails instead of a single nail. One of the best things, there's two great things I learned along the way that are bits of wisdom that I picked up, is I had this general who ran a division, and he's like, I know everything except for what's happening on the ground. If you can bring me the ground truth, then I know like how to better. You don't need to give me the solution. I'll figure that part out. But what I don't know is, I can't go there and do what you do. I need more of that. And the other thing was an Afghan government leader. And he asked me this crucial question that I was able to bring back to the Americans that had made him completely change their mindset. Because remember, we're there to teach and train and enable this fledgling government. And he says, there's only room for one sword in the scabbard. Mm-hmm. So who's the sword? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, got it, and it changed everything about what we did in that region, because this guy was like, I'm the damn sword, get the hell out of the way. You can be a scabbard, you can be the leather lash that holds the scabbard to my belt, but you'd only be one sword. What are some of the things that you've picked up along the way that are like that? I mean, you can't stand on one nail, and there's so many nails that you could stand on individually, but at some point you're going to just recover a body, or you're just going to recover a picture of what used to be a body. And that's going to be the answer. It's not all good news.
Yeah. I think that for me, a big lesson, I mean, there's this one gentleman in the book, his real name is Khalid Al-Mari. Khalid is kind of like a mentor, an unbelievable friend. And I'll tell you, there are 3 Americans alive today, reporters alive today, thanks to this guy, who got them, 1 out of Yemen, 2 out of Syria. Just an unbelievable person, never took credit for it, extremely wise. He's the one who tells me in the book, don't be that barking dog, right? You're looking for information. Make sure that you know what you do when you catch up with the car. Don't just keep on barking. You better have a plan, like, plan your work, then work your plan. So he talks that way. But the thing that he always reminded me of, I didn't put in the book because it's always something between him and me, is he'd always say, if I messed up, or wasn't properly prepared for something, or if he was a little disappointed with my focus, he'd always grab me by the chin and say, you want to have a seat at the table, or you want to be on the menu? Mm-hmm. And he always, it always stuck with me, that kind of work. Like, there are 2 kinds. It's okay. It's perfectly okay to be on the menu, but you have to understand you're not going to have a seat at the table then. And so, you go through these stories, and I don't want to over dramatize these things, these searches for hostages and searches for information about hostages, because it's really step by step by step. And it's it's very granular work. You know that from your own experience. Like, people have these romanticized visions that you parachute in and it's some grand thing. It's silly. It is so granular, and it's grunty work. It's really hard work. And you really have to be willing to put in those hours. There are no shortcuts. But at the end, it's keeping yourself grounded that way. Like, don't overplay your hand, right? But remember you make a mistake, you go to the other side of the tracks. You now are on the menu. You no longer have a seat at the table. So that's the kind of wisdom that for me. And then you have the night that I spent with the guy called the Sheikh in the book. That he is the head of a powerful militia in South Beirut. So anyone who reads the footnotes will know who I'm talking about there. Someone sanctioned by the U.S. It's a night I'll never forget, because this is this militia, this powerful religious leader who starts challenging me on religion, on the symbol of the eagle, on assimilation in the U.S., on civil rights movement in the U.S., and I was not prepared for that. It felt like someone's holding my head underwater. That's what it felt like really in that time. So you're never quite prepared for all those moments. Mm-hmm. The more authentic you are, and you sort of remember your core principles, it's almost like muscle memory then kicks into that, and that's the only way to go through this.
When you're looking for someone evil and you catch them, you better be ready. I mean, you need to have, I know, like, as soon as I walk off the camp, I've got my little system and boundaries and mindsets that I put myself in. And I'm the happiest guy as long as you're outside of that bubble. But once you cross into the bubble, I take different decisive action. There was one point in the book where I'm like, Daniel should just get up and leave right now and force this guy to call him back, right? And it's easy for me to say that sitting in my armchair reading a book, but you're there in the moment. And actually that guy gets up and spins on you and walks away, and it's like, oh, and you made that decision in that moment. You might have made the better decision than I might have made, but you knew that someone had to get up at that point because you were reaching the conclusion and somebody had to put a period on that meeting. It doesn't mean it's the last meeting, but all of these things, this granular stuff you're talking about, by the way, constantly exhausted. I get it. I heard it in the book. You're like, I was so tired.
Right.
That was, because you have, this is for the audience more than anything else. We're traveling, we're prepping, we're processing, we're meeting, and it never stops. So a 30-hour day, that's normal. I
Right.
mean, because you go until you go because the pace is slow, but when the pace is fast, you can't relent. You have to stay up and go through it. It's a remarkable book and remarkable tale. And I'm so glad you told this story, because we way underestimate how hard it is to survive in Syria, even to this day. How there are slaves we talk about slavery and then the 400 years, there's actual slaves being sold right now today on this planet, and we don't seem to give two shits about that. Like, we're desperate to tear ourselves apart, but it's really happening in Syria and in Libya and these other areas.
Absolutely. I mean, our foundation's active in Libya, and so I'm very involved there. And so it's really interesting to see that European countries lose their minds because you have a few migrants come across boats across the Mediterranean to Italy or Spain. But the fact that you have an active slave market in Benghazi, in Sirte, in Tripoli, in a lot of the northern coastal cities in Libya, an active slave market with people from Niger, from sub-Saharan Africa traveling through there are being sold. It's not something that particularly phases us. And I'm not trying to be a moralist about it. It's not that. It's just that I think we at least need to be informed. At least to be informed. It's okay to say, well, I'm going to base my foreign policy based on our domestic interests. You can be honest about sort of the Kissinger approach. I have no problem with that. Just be honest about it. Save us all the virtue talk. That's the only thing I would say.
Yeah. And don't make our job any harder than it has to be. We
Totally.
do these things. Yeah.
Totally.
It's an incredible thing. What part of it are you most proud of? The book, not the story, but just like, because you've done something pretty incredible here.
Look, I think the most proud I am of getting the two girls out and giving them a chance of a new life. It's meaningless in a cosmic sense. I get that. Just like I'm meaningless in a cosmic sense. Whether I exist or don't exist doesn't make a difference. It makes a minor difference to people in my immediate family for a short period of time. But in terms of finding purpose and finding a certain meaning, why we're doing it, why we're sacrificing, why we're going through all that, being able to affect two people's lives whose lives probably would have ended pretty soon otherwise, and give them that and have them be in your life and give you back so much more than you ever able to be. It's what I'm the most proud of. I will say, and nothing to do with a book or whether it becomes a movie, any of the other stuff. It's sort of where you look back and say, okay, there was a lot of hardship. I made a lot of mistakes, but that was really worth it. And so those are those moments, and I do feel blessed. And that's true for any hostage negotiation. It's obviously many end terribly. Many hostages get executed. Many times you're not able to succeed. You can't even get proof of life in some cases. There are hostages in Syria that have been there since before the Arab Spring started 10 years ago. But certainly since the spring started, hostages have been there for 10, 8, 9, 7 years. No one is probably ever going to hear of them again. They're heartbreaking stories. Sometimes we can just bring closure to the family. It is it's a purpose. And I feel blessed when I can do something of that, like that. It's just a short moment in my life. We know what it's like when you're serving. There's a different sense of purpose than just sort of going through the grind. And sometimes it's hard to adjust to civilian life afterwards, because without that purpose, the sacrifice becomes a little bit hard.
Yeah, you're telling me. It's when you have that kind of impact on something, and then all of a sudden, and for me, largely, I've been unemployable since I've come back, and they're like, "Well, you can go guard something," and I'm like, "You don't understand how."
Right.
How hard it is to go work in this highly complex, highly dangerous environment. And I know you'll appreciate this. Like, I'm good enough at my job that I'm getting introduced to people that no one else even knows.
Right.
And I'm meeting these elders, and then you come back and you're not even employable. I mean, it's like, oh, come on, this is it's hard. Just again, thanks for coming on and talking about this. Thanks for writing the book. I always talk about the superhero part. Like it'll sound like you're a superhero, but the reality is, and I bet this is true for you, if you were to watch me work on a day-to-day basis, you'd think Pete's just fooling around, talking to people and having lunches and stuff.
Right.
But the whole time, my brain's just spinning and I'm working exceptionally hard, and it's just absolutely using up a lot of energy to do these things right. And so I know what you do. I see it and I get it. And I try my best to tell these kind of stories so people can understand just how improbable it is. And there are so many times in the world where, if not for you in that place, in that time with your skill set, it would be nobody ever. It's a 1 in 100 chance that you get those girls out, or 1 in a million even.
I appreciate that, Pete.
Right person, right time. Yeah.
I really appreciate it. God bless you, and and thanks for what you do, because you have to be willing to do it. That's sort of by definition away from microphones, away from cameras, and so there's no parade when you come home, and that's okay. But it is there are moments where you're sort of in your own reality, and you're walking around with people around you, thinking, "God, you guys have no idea. You just don't understand." And that's okay. It's part of the deal. That's what we sign up for. Yeah, we sign up for that.
Stand by. Let me wrap this thing up.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.